On the 3rd of July 1973, 3,000 people packed into Hammersmith Odeon in London for what they thought was just a normal gig. What they didn't realise was that they were about to witness one of the most dramatic moments in popular music. But to understand what happened on that night, we don't need to go back to London or David Bowie. We've got to come to a garden here in Hull.
It's a god-awful small affair to the girl with the mousy hair, but her mommy is yelling no, and her daddy has told her to go, but her friend is nowhere to be seen. Now she walks through her sunken dream.
There's an old English saying, it's a prayer really, and it's from the 17th century, and it says, from hell, Hull and Halifax, good Lord deliver us. Hell, for its obvious reasons. Halifax, apparently it had some kind of guillotine. But Hull, with its furious river, was not a place to mess with. So in 1960, while Liverpool's Cavern Club was incubating the Beatles and London's West End was exploding with youth culture, Hull was doing what it always has done, and it was just getting on with it. No fanfare, no photographers, no cultural mythology, but yet somewhere in the back rooms of Hull's pubs and dance halls, in places like this, the halfway house, something was quietly happening. There were 3 young men learning to play music, and their names were Mick Ronson, Trevor Boulder and Mick Woodmansey, and none of them knew each other yet, but none of them could imagine what were about to come. Now in places like this, they'd play Chicago blues style music.
Oh, I'd love that.
Which seems a million miles away from Chicago, but that's what they did. I love that style of music, don't you?
Yeah, I love it, really do like it.
You can almost imagine now, but they've still got live music on. What I like about this as well is, like if you go to some other places, it'd be all over the wall, wouldn't it? Like Liverpool, you know, they celebrate their icons, but over here, you wouldn't even know. You could walk past this place and not even know.
Well, I bet there's people drinking in there that don't know Mick Ronson has been in there.
Yeah. This used to be called the Skyline Ballroom, and in 1967, a young guitarist from America called Jimi Hendrix played here in Hull. Can you believe it?
Jimi Hendrix played here?
Yeah, on Rag Week. We're called Rag Week. They came and played there. I mean, that goes to show like what the setting of Hull was really, but it's a shame to see that it's been knocked down, or I don't know what's happening to it, but it used to have columns outside it. I think they've gone.
Big glass doors.
It looks like a pretty amazing thing, but all that front's gone now.
Now tell me where you're going with that gun in your hand. Down to shoot my lady, 'cause I caught her messing around with another man. Yes, I'm going down to shoot my lady, 'cause I caught her messing around with another man.
So these are like the streets where Mick grew up.
Yep.
He was born on 26th of May 1946. He was the first son of George Ronson and Minnie Ronson. So they were a whole family, quite religious as well. Music were in their house very early. A neighbour on these streets gave him an accordion when he was only 3 years old. But then came the piano lessons, and then recorder at school, and then he did harmonium in the family church. But Mick had bigger ambitions than hymns. He wanted to be a cellist, so he started violin lessons as preparation. So he practiced and he got better, but then Hull pushed back because imagine here in 1960s, I guess, imagine doing it now. A young boy walking through the streets carrying a violin case were a bit of a target, so they'd mock him and ridicule him, and that's kind of what it's like, isn't it, in northern towns. Anybody that wants to step outside of what they're supposed to be doing, they get mocked. He quietly put the violin away and he didn't play for years. Later he decided to pick up the guitar, and he loved the sound of it and the way that you could make a string bend. He started listening to people like Jeff Beck, Eric Clapton, Jimi Hendrix, and these gritty streets that forced him to put a violin away actually made him pick up the guitar and find rock and roll. just had a really warm welcome here, haven't we?
Yeah,
We're
we have,
at Brough Village Hall, or Ellerton, I think they call it.
Yeah.
But basically, the lady that runs this, she knew something to do with Mick Ronson, didn't she? And she's kindly invited in to have a look around. But there's a female fashion show, and I've just walked down a catwalk. But anyway, so this was the first gig that Mick Ronson had with the Mariners, and he were only 17. So they had the debut show here, and they were paid 10 shillings.
I bet you were so excited.
That's 50 pence in today's money.
Wow.
Or if you're in America, that's 60 cents. And that was split between the whole band.
The whole band, not each.
So, no. So it weren't very glamorous for it.
No.
But a fellow musician who saw Ronson play that night, he was a singer called Benny Marshall. And he remembered that Mick was somewhat anonymous. He was lost in the shadow of another guitarist who was already a local favourite. And that were a man called Rick Kemp. But he later found fame as the bass player of a band called Steel Eye Span.
90 years old this year, the Village Hall.
It could be a spoonful of coffee.
We are in the Duke of Cumberland.
Yeah.
This is in a place called North Ferriby. So from the Mariners, Ronson moved to a band called the Cresters.
Okay, a new band now then.
Yeah. And this is where things started to move on a bit. So the Cresters built a real following, and they have regular nights.
Yeah.
Mondays at the Halfway House.
Yeah.
Thursdays at the Ferryboat Hotel. Fridays at the Regal Ballroom in Beverley. And Sundays, at Duke of Cumberland. So I don't know where they used to put the band.
So Mick was in here then?
Yeah, on a Sunday night. This was his residency, I guess you could call it. But they did it week after week, month after month. And it was in the Cresters that he was given his nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life. Do you know what that was?
Mick? Micko?
Rono.
Rono.
You were close. So Mick were getting better, and everyone could see it. So in mid-1965, Mick Ronson did what most ambitious young men from Hull had always done. And he packed his bag and he went to London. But it didn't work. He joined a band called The Voice, and that turned out to be sponsored by a religious sect called The Process, so he left that. And then he joined a Motown covers band called The Wanted. He played in that, but he struggled. So in 1966, with no money, nowhere to go, Mick Ronson came home to Hull.
This could be Rotterdam or anywhere, Liverpool or Rome, 'cause Rotterdam is anywhere, anywhere alone.
So back in Hull, he found his old bandmates, Benny Marshall and Jim Simpson, and they'd still been working, but under the name The Rats. So Mick joined them, and they recorded 3 singles and an album, The Rise and Fall of Bernie Gripplestone.
Is that the name of it?
Yeah, that were done at a local studio called Fairview. But by 1969, The Rats were gone. Every door had closed, and Mick Ronson, 23 years old, classically trained, one of the most naturally gifted guitarists in England. He took a job with Hull City Council, and just like that, the dream was over. So it's 1970, and Mick is putting some lines out for a rugby pitch. So he's got a pot of creosote and a brush, and he's just got the quiet resignation now of a man that's accepted that this is probably it for him. So the question that he had was, is it possible to make it? And the answer that he got was no. So that's it, innit? You come back, well, I'll just settle into my gardening. But then there was a guy called John Cambridge, and he arrived, and he was a drummer, but he was from Hull, just like Mick. But he'd managed to make it in London, so he'd gone down there, and it worked out. He got himself a job as a drummer for a young singer-songwriter, and I reckon you're going to know this person.
Right, yeah.
And because he was generating quite a stir down there, David Bowie. Cambridge had been pestering David Bowie, and his producer, he was a young Canadian called Tony Visconti. I don't know if you've heard of that name.
No, but it's a cool name.
It's a really cool name, very, very famous and like very influential.
Right.
But he kept saying, you know, I know this guitarist in Hull. You need to hear him. You need to hear him. You got to think, he's like, this guitarist in Hull is now just putting lines down for a rugby pitch.
Yeah.
They finally said, right, go and get him. So Cambridge came back up here to Hull.
Yeah.
And he found his old friend marking these lines out. So I found this quote from Cambridge. So this is in his own words. He says, Ronson was dressed in a navy donkey jacket and his trousers were tucked into his wellies. And then I had to persuade Mick to come to London while walking up and down the pitch with him. A bit like what I'm doing with you now. But Mick didn't want to go. He'd already tried it, you know, he felt a bit defeated. And he knew what London did to boys from here with big dreams. But anyway, he quietly said, yeah, fair enough, I'll give it a go. Mick Ronson and David Bowie first met in February 1970. And 2 days later, they were doing a recording session at the BBC with John Peel. Can you remember John Peel?
Yeah, wow.
Now, Tony Visconti were one of the most respected producers in the history of rock music.
Really? Wow.
But he remembers that moment clearly, and he said, Mick Ronson just floored us. When David and I met him, we knew he'd fit in looks-wise, but we had no idea what was coming until he picked up his Les Paul and played for us. He really didn't have to be taught the few songs we'd already worked up. Mick watched our hands on the guitar and bass necks and he just knew what to play. But it wasn't only the guitar, because if you remember, when he was growing up, he played piano, violin, harmonium, accordion, recorder. All of it came back, and after watching Visconti write out musical parts for a keyboard player, Ronson did something that astonished everyone in the room. He sat down and he wrote a mini score for 4 recorders. I bet you'd love that, actually. You play a bit of recorder, don't you? And you can hear that today in the song All the Madmen from the 1970s album, The Man Who Sold the World. So imagine that, a gardener from Hull writing out orchestral parts in a London studio.
He wasn't expecting that, really, was he?
I don't think anybody was. So that's how it started. But by the time they reached the next album in 1971, Hunky Dory, Mick were writing these mad, lush string arrangements. Changes, you must have heard that song. Life on Mars.
Yep.
That's all Mick's work. So you got to think about that. It's not a session player that did that. That's just a gardener from Hull.
Wow, I'm pretty impressed with that, actually.
Well, there's a producer called Ken Scott, and he said, well, he worked with Ronson and he worked with Bowie through their entire through this entire period. And he said that Ronson was a major part of the team, and it brought David to the forefront of modern music, and that David might not have been where he was if it wasn't for Mick.
No way, really?
Now that seems a remarkable thing to say.
Yeah, it does.
People that knew Ken, they said that he was not a man of exaggeration. Now the lineup that would change everything came together piece by piece. David Bowie, Mick Ronson, Tony Visconti on bass until Visconti were replaced by Trevor Boulder, but Trevor were from Hull. And he'd been part of the same musical world as Mick had been when they grew up. And on drums, they got Mick Woodmansey, and he was called Woody to everyone else.
Yeah.
And guess what?
What?
He was from Hull as well.
No, did all 3 of them?
So 3 of the 4 men who would become the Spiders from Mars had grown up in the same city. And there's actually a plaque that's in Hull train station. And it's saying that when they set off to go on the little expedition to David Bowie, they'd get on the train there and leave Hull train station down to London. So this is Hull. Shouldn't really have made these stars, should it? Do you remember John Cambridge from earlier in our story, the guy that went to see Mick on the rugby field?
Yes.
Well, he didn't end up in Spiders from Mars because, well, there's talk of maybe a bit of a disagreement, maybe heated words, but I think it all settled on that basically Tony Visconti and David Bowie were trying to create the sound.
Yeah, they were
and
looking for something.
he didn't, unfortunately, work into it all. Bit of a shame for him, really.
Yeah, because
he went and got Mick, and then he got pushed out. Spiders from Mars.
Yeah.
You ever wonder where that name came from?
Yeah, it's a strange name, isn't it?
Yeah, so basically there were a real event on 27th of October 1954, and it was during a football match in Florence, Italy, and more than 10,000 spectators looked up, and there were all these unidentified flying objects hovering above the stadium. That's what they said. 10,000 people. Wow. I mean, it's not just like some people, just one person seen it. But there were silvery web-like filaments that descended from the sky and covered the landscape. And the objects were never conclusively explained. But they thought that it might be spiders that were migrating in the sky by the wind, and the wind took it.
Okay.
No, that happens, doesn't it? You hear about stuff like that. Anyway, this crowd of 10,000 people thought that they were looking at Martian spacecraft, And David Bowie loved that story, and it captured something in his science fiction brain. But he'd already done Space Oddity, hadn't he?
Yeah.
So, but that were it, and that's where the Spiders from Mars came from.
What a cool, that's a brilliant story.
I think so. Before Hunky Dory got into the shops, the four of them were back in the studio doing some more work, and that was the rise and fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. The album was released on 16th of June 1972, and by the first week it had reportedly sold around 8,000 copies just in Britain. Now for 1972, that were massive.
Yeah.
It entered the UK album charts in the top 20 and climbed to number 5, and then stayed on the charts with re-entries for close to 2 years.
2 years?
2 years, and by the end of 1972, it had sold 95,968 copies in Britain.
That's fantastic.
And by the time it was done, worldwide sales were variously estimated at around 7 million copies.
7 million.
Now, I think we can all agree that that was pretty special.
Yes.
But it wasn't that made that moment special, really.
Right.
Because the moment that told you what all this meant happened on the 6th of July 1972 on BBC television. Can you remember Top of the Pops?
Oh, of course.
Well, David Bowie and the Spiders from Mars performed Starman.
Yeah.
And Bowie was extraordinary, otherworldly and magnetic, something that had never been seen on British television before. But there was a moment during that performance that no one who saw it ever forgot. So Bowie went up to his guitarist and he draped his arms around Mick Ronson's shoulders. And by today's standards, that might not mean much, but in conservative post-war Britain in 1972, that gesture landed like a thunderclap. Some viewers were absolutely horrified, but millions of others, young people who'd never seen their own strangeness reflected back at them, well, they felt something unlock. And guess what?
What?
The album exploded.
Fighting in the dance hall. Oh man, look at those cavemen.
The follow-up album, Aladdin Sane, was released in 1973. It had advance orders of around 100,000 copies even before they pressed
Really?
it. It entered the UK album chart at number 1, and it was Bowie's first ever chart topper. And it stayed there for 5 whole weeks. During that summer, David Bowie had got 5 albums in the album charts simultaneously. Mick's contribution during this period extended far beyond the stage. He and David Bowie produced Lou Reed's Transformer. It's one of the most celebrated albums in rock history. Some songs you might even know. Walk on the Wild Side.
Yes, I know that.
And Lou Reed later acknowledged how crucial Ronson's arrangements and playing were to the sound of that record. And he also composed and arranged a stunning orchestral accompaniment to Ian Hunter's Sea Diver for Mott the Hoople. And he later helped John Mellencamp with Jack and Diane. Now you know that song, don't you?
I do, yeah, I do, yeah. I was singing that to you, weren't I?
Well, apparently it's one of America's most recognisable opening riffs. You were always arranging, always building, and you were the architect behind the building that got somebody else somewhere. But in the summer of 1973, the tour was running, the world was watching, and it seemed like it might go on forever. By the summer of 1973, the Ziggy Stardust tour had been running for over a year without a real break. Trevor Bolder and Mick Woodmansey had no idea that the end was coming. Only Mick Ronson had been told a few days before, quietly, by David Bowie himself. And this is where we get to the Hammersmith Odeon bit. This isn't the Hammersmith Odeon, but it's the closest we could get in Hull. So the show opened with Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, but they used the version that were in A Clockwork Orange. Have you ever seen that film?
No, I've never seen it.
I've never seen it.
No.
But they played everything. Hang On to Yourself, Ziggy Stardust, Changes, Space Oddity. They covered Rolling Stones and Velvet Underground.
Wow.
And as a special guest, which is awesome, Bowie had invited Jeff Beck. Jeff Beck is obviously Mick Ronson's guitar hero and mine.
Okay.
The man whose playing had originally inspired him to pick up the electric
Wow,
guitar.
so you played with him?
Yeah, so they joined him for 3 songs. They were a documentary filmmaker there at the time, and he were only there to do a few promotional songs.
Right.
But I think he thought something were going down. These people have a kind of like a
Sixth
nose
sense.
for stuff, don't they? And he carried on recording, and it was actually caught on camera, but nobody knew what were coming. So just before the last number,
Yeah.
David Bowie stepped up to the microphone and the room went quiet. And this is what he said. He said, "Everybody, this has been one of the greatest tours of our lives. I would like to thank the band. I would like to thank our road crew. I would like to thank our lighting people. Of all of the shows on this tour, this particular show will remain with us the longest, because not only is it the last show of the tour, but it's the last show that we'll ever do."
Ever?
The crowd screamed just like you did, Claire. No, people were crying. You don't seem too emotional about it.
I would have been very upset if I'd have been there.
People couldn't believe it.
Wow.
But the press quickly reported it as David Bowie's retirement from live performance. And when it was over, he simply said, "Thank you very much. Bye-bye. We love you." The house lights went up. But he wasn't retiring from music, he was just killing Ziggy Stardust. But for the Spiders from Mars, the distinction barely mattered, because for them it were over.
Oh no!
Trevor and Mick found out the same way as the crowd did. So after the show, Bowie held a small private party, and he and Ronson, together with their partners, went on holiday to Italy.
Oh, nice.
They were old friends and they were taking a breath. And in Italy, Mick Ronson began writing music, and that would be material that would become his first solo album. And he stayed with Bowie for one more record, Pin-Ups, a covers album released in 1973. But then it was done. David Bowie moved on. He became the Thin White Duke, went to Berlin with Brian Eno.
Yeah.
Soul music, a global transformation, and a global icon. Mick Ronson, who'd played on 5 of the greatest albums Bowie'd ever made, received no songwriting credit on any of the classic Bowie tracks.
Any of them?
No, but it was his sound that helped to define him. He didn't get any credit for Life on Mars, none for Changes, not one credit on any of those songs. But he did go on to do extraordinary work. He played with Bob Dylan on the Rolling Thunder Review tour, and he continued to work with Ian Hunter, and he produced Morrissey's Your Arsenal album. Dana Gillespie, who knew both Bowie and Ronson well, said simply that when David Bowie dropped the Spiders in 1973 and moved on to work with other musicians, Mick Ronson was very hurt by that. Being as he was, a quiet lad from Hull, loyal, Hull boy to the bones, he never said anything and he kept his mouth shut about it. So Mick Ronson was diagnosed with liver cancer in 1992, and he came back home to Hull, and he was working on a solo album. They were called Heaven and Hull. David Bowie performed at the Freddie Mercury concert in 1992 with Mick Ronson, and they played together.
Right.
And during a spoken passage, Bowie became quite emotional, and many believed it was because he knew that Ronson was dying. He died on 29th of April 1993, and he was only 46 years old.
Oh, it's terribly sad.
Later, David Bowie said that losing Mick was one of the greatest losses of his life. And that's from a man that dismantled the band without warning, from a man who never gave him a songwriting credit on those songs, but it was real, and whatever complicated thing existed between them still meant a lot to him. In 2017, Hull was named the UK City of Culture, the city that was once cursing a beggar's prayer, the city that mocked boys for carrying violin cases, the city that made its most gifted son a municipal gardener. His sister Maggie said, "He was and always will be my hero through all my life." So there you go, Claire, the boy they laughed at, the gardener they overlooked, the man who built Ziggy Stardust, Hull's greatest secret, and one of the greatest rock musicians who ever lived.